I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. Shadow of the Erdtree is better than Elden Ring's base game in almost every way. Now, this isn't to say the base game is bad by any means, but I always found it had glaring issues that I was really hoping would be improved upon in the DLC. So after spending 50 plus hours completing it, not only did I find it improved upon majority of the issues I had with the main game, it also improved upon aspects of the game I didn't even have issues with. Now, I'm not just going to be continuously glazing the DLC throughout this video because some parts of it really did disappoint me, but man, overall, Shadow of the Erdtree is awesome, and it's actually so damn big that it might as well be considered a sequel instead of a DLC. And with that said, I'm going to dive straight into what I think the DLC improved upon, but first, here's your spoiler warning. So if you haven't guessed it already, I'm talking about dungeons and caves, and for me, this one was probably the biggest issue I experienced in the main game, specifically with how repetitive and unrewarding they were to explore. To give you an idea of what I mean, if you played Elden Ring and explored about 10 of their minor dungeons, I think it's pretty fair to say that the next 40 won't really surprise you. What would surprise you was how similar the layouts looked, with the same enemies, and on top of that, the boss could be guaranteed to be repeated in the dungeon or in the open world. On a personal level, I honestly found this kinda lame, and so, going into the DLC, I was already primed to be skeptical of these caves and dungeons, but I was happily surprised at how much better they were. Not only that, the DLC actually added new styles of dungeons called jails and forges, and goddamn, these looked beautiful. The jails in particular were my favorite. They had insane depth in terms of level design, they never got repetitive, and honestly, with how complex they seemed, they felt like mini legacy dungeons. On top of that, the bosses weren't disappointing at the end. The forges, on the other hand, didn't even have a boss at the end, but I still thought they were great to explore. They had their own visual style with unique level design, and they housed new enemies you didn't see anywhere else. Overall, they were a great change from what I was used to in the base game. However, I will say that even though the reward at the end was pretty good, I would still prefer a boss fight, but I think that's just my preference. Now, the DLC did also add dungeons and caves with a similar style to the main games, but I would argue that these were the best versions of those types. Even if they initially felt the same, that quickly changed after I realized how deep they went and how grand they felt. They also had unique mechanics which varied how you had to traverse them, but on top of that, there was usually a nice surprise at the end with a unique boss fight or an exit that would lead to a new area. All of these honestly felt so much more rewarding than the main game, and I was genuinely disappointed when I found out that I had explored every single one the DLC had to offer. So the only real negative I have here is that there weren't more of them, but it's clear FromSoft learned from the main game that it's quality over quantity. That title pretty much sums up how I felt for most of my time when experiencing the open world level design in the Land of Shadow. The verticality was insane and I loved it. I was constantly being teased by far off areas of the map that I couldn't get to, but then eventually not only would I find my way down there, I would find out there were multiple ways to get there, and for me this really spoke to the complexity of the level design with how interconnected everything felt. If I'm being honest, the last time I felt level design this good in a FromSoft game was all the way back in Dark Souls 1. Now, I'm not saying the level design in the main game of Elden Ring was bad by any means, but I think it's fair to say that it only ever felt interconnected sometimes. The open world specifically, at least to me, at times felt spread out with parts of the world feeling like it came in its own sections rather than being constantly interwoven. It did sometimes have some verticality which was cool, but nothing compared to the DLC. The difference is honestly chalk and cheese. Seeing as I'm talking about level design though, what I will say about the main game is that it has consistently some of the best legacy dungeons FromSoft has ever done. And while the legacy dungeons in the DLC are really good, like with how sick Midgar Man's is and the Shadowkeep design being on the same level as Stormville Castle or Leyndell, at least in my opinion, it was also slightly inconsistent because there were also disappointing legacy dungeons that felt quite linear and forgettable, with the worst being Castle Mensis, even though it had one of the best bosses. But something did truly disappoint me with the level design in the DLC, and that was some areas felt strangely empty and pointless, almost like FromSoft ran out of time to fully completed. The finger areas and Forbidden Woods are prime examples because I wasted so much goddamn time running around only to find out it was basically empty. The only thing I did find was relatable messages from other players saying futility, oh futility. Now I do understand that yes, these places are probably meant to be barren for lore reasons, but the whole game is based on exploring every inch of the map because you already know how crazy and secretive their level design usually is. So how am I supposed to know when not to explore? Luckily though, this didn't happen too often. The main game does have this issue too anyway, and I don't think it takes away from how much more immersive and better the overall world and level design is compared to it. Now this one I was just not expecting, and I had no issue with this in the base game. I'm talking about the visuals and art design. I actually couldn't believe how visually breathtaking this DLC was. Like, even the goddamn tree in the background looked better than the one in the main game. Basically, every area in the Land of Shadow, whether it be in the open world, the dungeons, or even the legacy dungeons, they all felt visually unique and really stood out. This was something I never criticized the game for because overall the art design was great and there were many moments of wow, this looks sick. I never even thought this needed to be improved, but here's the difference I noticed between that and the DLC. So I would say the most visually memorable experience in the base game would have to be going down that elevator and seeing the Starry Galaxy look of Shifa River. There were others that looked great too, but this one came to mind first. Essentially for me, this was where the game peaked visually. In the DLC, I felt that this visual peak was met constantly in so many areas over and over and over again. I literally felt like I was being visually rewarded all the time, and it made me want to explore just so I could see more of it. I absolutely love this, so to me, FromSoftware hands down improved upon this in the DLC, and I have no complaints about it whatsoever. Now, do I mean insanely good or insanely bad? Well, it's a bit of both. But in general, I was much more impressed with the quality of bosses in this DLC. First, to give you an idea of how I experience bosses, I don't use summons or spirit ashes, personally because I find it trivializes them, and also my mates would roast the shit out of me if I did. Now in the main game, the biggest issue with the bosses is probably with how often they're repeated, and I don't just mean repeated 2 or 3 times, I mean repeated 6, 7 or 8 times. The other issue is the inconsistent quality of the main bosses. Whether it be annoying camera issues, bosses always running away, or terrible duo fights, you would always experience these annoying fights in between the really good ones. It just felt up and down all the way to the end. For the most part, I think the DLC improved upon both of these issues, but it also hit a level the main game's bosses never reached. First, in regards to repetition, I really thought I was going to see bosses repeated in the dungeons, just like how they were in the main game. But I was pleasantly surprised to see each of these places had a boss that was unique to that area. The one time where I thought this was going to happen was when I saw a second Death Knight, only to get my ass handed to me because he had a whole different weapon and moveset. Now with the bosses in the open world, this was a little different. For the most part, the new side bosses felt unique, and honestly, if they repeated one a second time like the Great Red Bears, I felt this wasn't an issue because it's just one more time. But I do have an issue repeating the Lion Dancer, a main boss, because this just takes away from the unique spectacle of it being a remembrance fight. The only thing here is the main game also does this, and more often. Where repetition does become an issue though is with all the damn dragons and all the bosses put into the DLC from the main game. And while yes, the Ghost Flame dragons are unique, there's 3 of them and their movesets are barely unique, especially after you fought the other dragons at Jagged Peak. So I was a bit disappointed when I saw base game dragons repeated, but also tree sentinels and falling star beasts, but above all 4 more ulcerated tree spirits. So to me, this might be the worst part about the DLC, because I can't help but feel FromSoft just threw some of these bosses in there just to fill up some space, because again, they were running out of time. But I can't say the DLC did this worse, because these were all problems the main game deals with anyway, and honestly the level of repetition is far higher than in the DLC. What is a completely different story though is the quality of the main bosses. Overall, they were amazing, with some of them completely surpassing the quality of the bosses in the base game. I actually think R'Lana, Mesmer, the Lord of Frenzied Flame, and Bale are some of the best bosses FromSoft has ever done. Honestly, all of these fights felt super balanced, they were visual spectacles, there was no artificial difficulty, and it was all skill based on whether I could do them or not. This to me is perfect boss design. However, I was surprised 2 of them plus Romina didn't have any opening cinematics when they should have. Again, almost like FromSoft didn't have time. Now, with all the other main bosses, they weren't as great, but they were still really good, and some even had some really cool surprises. Like the fact that this Erdtree boss respawns a third time really threw me off, and I love that. Oh, and I just have to mention this, but even though this isn't technically a boss fight, the NPC battle at the end was honestly sick, and I hope FromSoft does stuff like this more often. It's not all praise though, because I did however have problems with some bosses being hard because the difficulty was just out of my control. I haven't seen this talked about too much, but the first Lion Dancer was really frustrating. Even after I'd learned the entire moveset, my biggest battle was with the camera. If it got too close, I couldn't make out what attack was coming, and if I got too close to the wall, I couldn't see shit. Now up next, a lot of people are probably expecting complaints about Commander Gaius, whatever you say there, but at first, his charge attacks really tripped me out, but I figured it out quickly and it only took me 6 tries. Now, I've seen a lot online about it, I just didn't experience it, so maybe I got lucky or you just gotta get good. The boss that really drove me to the edge though was none other than Radahn. Now I gotta say, I loved his first phase, but his second phase to me was difficult for the wrong reasons. To put it simply, I found it very hard to make out what was happening on my screen with all the flashbangs. It also made my frames drop and call me crazy, but I swear Miquella's hair was getting in the way of being able to make out what attack was coming. What also solidified how annoying this boss was that after I beat him, that was it. There was no real conclusion to the DLC except for a random cinematic that added nothing to the ending. But even though this was a big negative for me and this whole point about the bosses has a lot of up and downs, I still think the quality of bosses is better in the DLC. Honestly, now that I mentioned that and everything else earlier on in the video, I'm not really sure what I could say the base game did better than the DLC. Like if I had to choose which I would enjoy replaying again, I would choose the DLC every time. The only problem there is I still have to replay the base game anyway to do that. But at the end of the day, both are amazing. I love FromSoft games and I hope they keep making bangers like this DLC in the future. That's it for me. As always, thank you for watching and I hope this video made you go yeah.